On February 16, 2005, a padded manila envelope arrived at the KSAS TV station in Wichita, Kansas. Inside was a piece of evidence that would instantly dismantle a 30-year reign of terror: a purple 1.44 megabyte Memorex floppy disk. For 3 decades, a phantom had manipulated the media and evaded one of the most exhaustive manhunts in American history. But in his arrogance, he asked investigators a simple question: can a floppy disk be traced? The answer he received was a lie, and that lie became the point of irreversibility in a cold case that had paralyzed a city. The investigative files from 1974 to 1991 were a labyrinth of dead ends. The Wichita Police Department had amassed thousands of pages of psychological profiles, handwriting analyses, and physical evidence, yet the perpetrator remained a ghost. The communications had ceased in the early 90s, leaving a void in the archives. Forensic technology advanced. DNA profiling became the gold standard, but without a suspect to match, the biological evidence sat dormant in temperature-controlled lockers. The case was a monumental blind spot in the justice system. In March 2004, the silence broke. A new letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle containing photographs of an unsolved 1986 crime scene. The return of the killer initiated a high-stakes psychological chess match. The Behavioral Analysis Unit of the FBI advised local detectives to keep the suspect engaged, to stroke his ego, and to push him toward a fatal error. The strategy was to transition his communications from analog paper trails to digital media. When the killer inquired via a classified ad if a floppy disk could be traced to a specific computer, the police responded through the newspaper, assuring him it was secure. It was a calculated procedural deception. When that purple Memorex disk was secured and logged into the chain of custody, it bypassed the standard fingerprint and trace evidence labs. It was routed directly to the Wichita Police Department Computer Crimes Unit. The forensic extraction was methodical. Investigators did not just look at the active files. They utilized EnCase forensic software to dive into the disk's unallocated space. Hidden within the sector data was the metadata of a deleted Microsoft Word document. The digital footprint revealed 2 crucial pieces of information. The document was last saved by a user named Dennis, and the software was registered to the Christ Lutheran Church. The digital evidence provided the coordinates. The physical world provided the target. A localized search of the Christ Lutheran Church leadership records immediately surfaced the name Dennis Rader, the congregation president. But a name and a deleted digital artifact do not meet the threshold for a capital murder arrest warrant. Investigators needed a biological anchor. They bypassed a direct confrontation, which could trigger the destruction of evidence or a flight response. Instead, they secured a warrant for a tissue sample belonging to Rader's daughter, held at a Kansas State University medical clinic. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation Forensic Laboratory processed the familial DNA. The genetic markers from the medical clinic sample were compared against the biological evidence preserved from the 1974 crime scenes. The forensic report returned a conclusive familial match. On February 25, 2005, the mechanical precision of digital forensics and the undeniable biological truth of DNA profiling converged. The arrest of Dennis Rader did not just close a 30-year cold case. It signaled a permanent paradigm shift in criminal investigations. The era of the untraceable phantom was dead, replaced by a permanent, inescapable digital shadow. The justice system relies on the illusion of infallibility. When absolute biological truth like DNA enters the courtroom, it does not just convict the guilty. It has the power to exonerate the innocent, unraveling decades of supposed forensic certainty. The definitive resolution of the BTK case highlighted the power of modern forensics, but it also cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the convictions that came before the genetic revolution. Absolute scientific clarity is a double-edged sword, and its retroactive application was about to expose a catastrophic vulnerability at the highest levels of law enforcement. The emotional weight of this realization is staggering. For every cold case closed by a definitive genetic match, a shadow fell over thousands of closed cases built on older subjective methodologies. The collateral damage of forensic evolution is the terrifying realization that men and women were sent to death row based on science that was, at its core, deeply flawed. The anchor of the American justice system was about to fracture under the weight of microscopic scrutiny, revealing that the truth was sometimes manufactured rather than discovered. To understand the magnitude of this fracture, we must examine the foundational bedrock of 20th century trace evidence. Before the genetic sequencing revolution, physical proximity to a crime was often established by a single, fragile filament, the human hair. It was the golden standard of trace evidence, presented to juries not as a probability, but as an absolute, irrefutable link between a suspect and a crime scene. It was a forensic silver bullet that closed cases and secured convictions with alarming efficiency. Prosecutors wielded hair analysis as a lethal weapon in the courtroom. Expert witnesses, cloaked in the authority of federal institutions, testified with a certainty that left defense attorneys paralyzed. The narrative was simple and devastatingly effective. A hair was found. The microscopic characteristics matched the defendant, and therefore the defendant was there. But this narrative was built on a foundation of subjective interpretation, devoid of the empirical data required to make such definitive claims. Step inside the FBI laboratory division during the 1980s and 1990s. It was a fortress of procedural authority, a sterile labyrinth of humming ventilation systems, stainless steel examination tables, and rows of high-powered optical microscopes. This was the epicenter of forensic science, the ultimate authority where local jurisdictions sent their most perplexing evidence, desperate for a federal mandate that would seal a conviction. The facility operated as the gold standard for criminalistics worldwide. The atmosphere within these walls was one of unquestioned supremacy. Examiners in crisp white coats peered through binocular lenses, analyzing slides mounted with trace evidence collected from the most violent crime scenes in the nation. The laboratory was not just a processing facility. It was an institution that manufactured truth. When a report was issued on official FBI letterhead, it carried a weight that juries found impossible to challenge, creating an environment where the examiner's word was law. The methodology at the center of this institutional power was microscopic hair comparison. The system required an examiner to place a crime scene hair and a known sample from a suspect under a comparison microscope. This instrument allowed the analyst to view both samples side by side within the same optical field, magnifying the internal structures up to 400 times their actual size. It was a visual, side-by-side test, heavily reliant on the expertise of the person looking through the glass. Examiners evaluated the structural morphology of the hair shaft. They documented the cuticle scale patterns, the density of the cortex pigmentation, and the continuity of the medulla. The protocol dictated that if these microscopic characteristics aligned perfectly across the two samples, an association could be declared. The system relied entirely on visual pattern recognition, a process fundamentally dependent on the human eye and the cognitive biases of the observer. The procedural breakdown occurred not in the observation, but in the articulation of those observations. There was no universally accepted standard for how many microscopic characteristics needed to match before an association was deemed conclusive. Furthermore, there was no empirical database establishing the statistical frequency of specific hair traits within the general population. An examiner could declare a match, but they could never mathematically quantify the probability of another individual possessing the exact same microscopic profile. Despite this glaring statistical void, FBI examiners routinely stepped into witness boxes and testified with absolute certainty. Transcripts from hundreds of trials reveal a pattern of forensic overstatement. Analysts testified that a crime scene hair was a definitive match to a defendant, often claiming that the odds of it belonging to anyone else were infinitesimally small. They transformed a subjective visual comparison into an illusion of mathematical certainty, effectively sealing the fate of the accused. The reckoning arrived when the subjective claims of microscopic hair analysis collided with the objective reality of mitochondrial DNA testing. When the FBI laboratory integrated advanced genetic sequencing in the late 1990s, they began re-examining the very hairs that had previously secured convictions. The biological data stripped away the subjective interpretations. DNA does not rely on the visual judgment of a human examiner. It relies on the immutable laws of molecular biology. The comparative results triggered a systemic shockwave. A massive internal review revealed that in over 250 trials, FBI examiners had provided flawed testimony regarding microscopic hair analysis. In more than 90% of those cases, the erroneous testimony favored the prosecution. The revelation did not just overturn convictions. It forced a complete rewrite of evidentiary standards, proving that even the most authoritative forensic institutions are vulnerable to the dangerous intersection of subjective science and absolute power. On February 16, 2005, a padded envelope arrived at the KSAS TV station in Wichita, Kansas. Inside rested a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk. For 31 years, the entity known as BTK had existed only as a ghost in the police archives, a shadow mocking law enforcement through cryptic letters and untraceable communications. But the moment that disk slid into a local newsroom computer, the phantom became bound to the physical laws of digital forensics. The game of cat and mouse had reached its point of irreversibility. The Wichita Police Department had chased this specter since 1974. The case files were a labyrinth of exhausted leads, degraded biological samples, and taunting poetry. Then, in 2004, the communications suddenly resumed. A series of packages containing jewelry, customized puzzles, and driver's licenses belonging to victims began appearing in drop boxes across the city. The killer was reasserting his presence, operating under the assumption that the investigative methodologies of the 21st century were as limited as those of the 1970s. This arrogance culminated in a highly specific inquiry. In a communication sent to the police, the killer asked a technical question. Could a floppy disk be traced back to a specific computer? He demanded an honest answer. Investigators placed a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle newspaper under the pseudonym Rex. The message was brief. Rex, it will be okay. It was a calculated, strategic deception. When the purple floppy disk was recovered from the television station, it was immediately transferred to the Wichita Police Department Computer Crimes Unit. Maintaining an unbroken chain of custody, forensic examiners did not access the disk through standard operating systems, which would permanently alter the data. Instead, they utilized EnCase forensic software to create a bitstream image, an exact sector-by-sector replica of the disk's contents. Surface analysis revealed a single, deleted Microsoft Word document, To the untrained eye, the text itself offered nothing of value, but digital forensics operates in the margins, within the unseen architecture of the software itself. Examiners targeted the document's object linking and embedding metadata. The 2005 Forensic Extraction Report yielded two critical fragments of buried data. First, the metadata showed the document had been modified by a user registered under the name Dennis. Second, the software license was registered to the Christ Lutheran Church. Investigators cross-referenced these two data points against municipal records in Park City, a suburb of Wichita. The query returned a single intersecting profile: Dennis Rader, the president of the church council and a local municipal compliance officer. The digital footprint provided the name, but metadata alone does not secure a conviction in a court of law. Investigators required an absolute biological anchor to connect the church council president to the 1974 crime scenes. Rader was under constant surveillance, but acquiring a direct DNA sample risked alerting him. The investigative pivot relied on familial DNA profiling. Detectives secured a warrant for medical records belonging to Rader's daughter, specifically targeting a routine pap smear previously collected at a Kansas State University medical clinic. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation Forensic Laboratory processed the tissue sample, extracting a partial genetic profile. They then compared this familial marker against the preserved biological evidence secured from the earliest crime scenes. The laboratory results confirmed a definitive paternal match. The arrest was executed on February 25, 2005. A routine traffic stop effectively ended a 3-decade reign of terror. The interrogation recordings reveal a man genuinely baffled by his capture, asking detectives how they had traced the disc after they promised they could not. The answer lay in the very technology he sought to exploit. The archive of the human shadow is vast, but it is rarely silent. In the end, it was not a brilliant criminal mastermind that brought the investigation to a close, but the quiet, immutable permanence of a digital footprint. The capture of Dennis Rader demonstrated the absolute, unyielding power of modern forensic certainty. DNA and digital metadata provide an empirical anchor, a mathematical truth that cannot be cross-examined into submission. But this era of undeniable scientific precision casts a long, dark shadow over the decades that preceded it. Before the genetic revolution, the justice system relied heavily on forensic methods that masqueraded as infallible science, securing convictions not through immutable data, but through subjective interpretation. The most catastrophic of these was microscopic hair comparison, a deeply flawed discipline that quietly condemned the innocent while the guilty remained free. The human toll of this forensic illusion is almost impossible to quantify. For decades, individuals were stripped of their freedom, locked inside maximum security facilities based on the testimony of a single expert holding a glass slide. The psychological devastation of wrongful conviction is absolute. These defendants sat in courtrooms knowing their own innocence, only to watch a credentialed federal examiner point to a magnified strand of hair and tell a jury it was a definitive match. The gavel fell, and lives were erased, buried under the weight of a scientific consensus that did not actually exist. Inside the brutal architecture of the American prison system, these men aged into irrelevance, their appeals repeatedly denied by courts that deferred to the original forensic testimony. The tragedy was not merely the loss of time, but the total gaslighting of the accused by the state. They were told that the science was absolute, that their own memory of innocence was a lie refuted by the microscope. Families fractured, reputations were permanently destroyed, and the true perpetrators of horrific crimes were left to offend again, all because the justice system prioritized the illusion of certainty over the rigorous demand for empirical proof. The collapse of this forensic house of cards began with the relentless pressure applied by post-conviction advocates. Organizations like the Innocence Project started utilizing early DNA testing to re-examine closed cases, exposing a terrifying pattern. Time and again, the genetic profiles extracted from crime scene evidence directly contradicted the sworn testimony of FBI hair examiners. It became undeniably clear that microscopic hair analysis was not merely prone to occasional error, but was fundamentally compromised by systemic exaggeration and a lack of baseline scientific standards. Faced with mounting, irrefutable DNA exonerations, the establishment was forced into an unprecedented reckoning. In a historic concession, the Department of Justice and the FBI entered into an agreement with the Innocence Project and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Together, they launched a massive independent review of thousands of historical cases processed by the FBI laboratory before mitochondrial DNA testing became the standard in the year 2000. It was a logistical and legal undertaking designed to audit the very foundation of late 20th century criminal convictions. The scale of the review required a descent into the deepest archives of the federal justice system. Teams of auditors and attorneys navigated labyrinthine storage facilities, pulling thousands of deteriorating cardboard boxes from metal shelving. Inside these boxes lay the physical remnants of destroyed lives. Yellowing trial transcripts, faded evidence logs, and thousands of microscopic glass slides were exhumed from the dark. The environment was clinical and silent, a stark contrast to the high-stakes courtroom drama where these flawed convictions were originally secured under the harsh glare of fluorescent lighting. Reviewers embarked on the grueling process of forensic archaeology. They were not just looking at the physical hair samples. They were dissecting the precise language used by examiners on the witness stand. Page by page, they scanned decades of testimony, searching for the fatal moments where an expert stretched a visual similarity into a statistical certainty. They hunted for the definitive statements that misled juries, documenting every instance where the boundaries of science were breached to secure a guilty verdict. To understand the magnitude of this forensic reckoning, one must examine the halls of the FBI laboratory in Washington, an institution long considered the undisputed vanguard of criminal justice. Behind its reinforced doors, rows of comparison microscopes stood as the ultimate arbiters of truth. For decades, the laboratory operated with an aura of infallibility. The environment was one of clinical, unyielding authority. Fluorescent lights illuminated sterile workstations where agents scrutinized the microscopic detritus of violent crimes. The laboratory was not merely a testing facility. It was the supreme court of physical evidence. Within this fortress, microscopic hair comparison became a cornerstone of prosecution. The methodology appeared elegant in its simplicity. An examiner would place a crime scene hair alongside a suspect's known sample under a high-powered comparison microscope. By adjusting the dual stage, the analyst viewed both strands simultaneously, evaluating variables such as pigment distribution, cuticular scale patterns, and medullary structure. The procedural manual required analysts to identify unique overlapping traits. They mounted the keratin strands on glass slides, using high-intensity transmitted light to illuminate the cellular structures. If these morphological features aligned, the analyst declared a visual match. However, unlike the rigid mathematical certainty of a genetic profile, this system relied entirely on human interpretation. There was no standardized metric for how many characteristics needed to match, nor was there a foundational database of population frequencies to determine the statistical probability of two people sharing the same hair profile. Hair is not a fingerprint. A single individual can shed hairs with drastically different microscopic profiles, while two unrelated individuals might possess strands that appear identical under 400 times magnification. The protocol demanded certainty where only ambiguity existed. The procedural protocols of the era masked this inherent subjectivity beneath a veneer of technical jargon. When these examiners took the witness stand, their procedural testimony was devastatingly effective. Clad in the authority of the federal government, they confidently informed juries that the suspect's hair was microscopically indistinguishable from the evidence. They frequently cited undocumented astronomical odds that had no basis in empirical science. Juries, lacking the scientific literacy to challenge federal experts, accepted these visual matches as absolute truth. Prosecutors built entire capital cases around a single strand of hair found on a victim's clothing or inside a suspect's vehicle, treating it as an irrefutable signature of guilt. The consequences of elevating this observational art to the status of hard science were catastrophic. A statistical review of the resulting convictions reveals a staggering systemic failure. The Department of Justice eventually conceded that out of 268 trials involving hair evidence, examiners provided flawed testimony in 257 of them. That equates to a 95% error rate. Innocent men and women were sent to maximum security prisons and, in several documented instances, to death row, based on an optical illusion sanctioned by the highest investigative authorities in the nation. The justice system had effectively weaponized a flawed methodology, locking away the innocent, while the true perpetrators remained undetected. The mechanism that finally shattered the illusion of microscopic hair analysis was a breakthrough in genetic technology. While traditional nuclear DNA profiling required the cellular material found in a hair follicle root, many crime scene hairs were shed naturally, leaving them rootless and analytically useless for early genetic tests. The investigative paradigm shifted with the advent of mitochondrial DNA sequencing. This new technique bypassed the nucleus entirely, targeting the abundant genetic material housed within the energy-producing structures of the cell. Because mitochondria are inherited strictly through the maternal line and exist in thousands of copies per cell, forensic scientists could now extract viable genetic profiles from the dead keratinized tissue of the hair shaft itself. Inside the sterile, climate-controlled environments of modern genetic laboratories, the ghosts of past investigations were subjected to a new standard of scrutiny. Technicians operating under strict anti-contamination protocols pulverized the decades-old hair shafts in liquid nitrogen. The extraction process required meticulous isolation, washing the fragments in specialized chemical baths to strip away environmental degradation before amplifying the microscopic yields of mitochondrial material. The hum of thermal cyclers replaced the quiet observation of the comparison microscope. The resulting electropherograms displayed sharp, undeniable peaks of nucleotide sequences on high-resolution monitors, rendering the old visual comparisons obsolete. When the mitochondrial sequencing was applied to the very hairs that had secured decades of convictions, the results were definitive and devastating. The digital readouts of base pairs proved that the microscopic matches were catastrophic optical illusions. The era of subjective forensic guesswork was permanently dismantled by the cold, unforgiving light of genetic certainty. This absolute certainty of genetic profiling, the very science that forced the audit of forensic history, traced its origins to a systemic pivot point in Leicestershire, England. Following the murders of 15-year-old Linda Mann in 1983 and Dawn Ashworth in 1986, the local constabulary faced a profound logistical deficit. They possessed the killer's genetic blueprint, but no name to attach to it. The response was an operational maneuver never before attempted. the initiation of the world's first mass biological dragnet. In January 1987, authorities requested blood and saliva samples from every male resident in the surrounding villages born between 1953 and 1970. Over 5,000 men voluntarily submitted to the screening. The procedural mechanics were exhaustive. Each sample underwent conventional blood typing first. Only those matching the type A profile and specific phosphoglucomutase enzyme profile recovered from the crime scenes were forwarded to the laboratory for full genetic sequencing. The dragnet concluded, and the results yielded a complete blind spot. The genetic profile of the killer was nowhere in the thousands of processed records. The vulnerability of the operation was not in the science, but in the chain of custody. On August 1, 1987, a conversation in a Leicester pub breached the investigation's perimeter. A bakery worker named Ian Kelly was overheard admitting that he had submitted his own blood sample under a forged passport on behalf of his colleague, Colin Pitchfork. Pitchfork had manufactured a meticulously layered deception, knowing his own biological signature would trigger a definitive match. Arrest records from September 1987 detail the immediate extraction of Pitchfork's actual blood sample. When the new autoradiograph was developed, the dark bands aligned perfectly with the biological evidence preserved from the footpaths. The mathematical probability of a false positive was 1 in 30 billion. Pitchfork's conviction established a permanent precedent in criminal jurisprudence, proving that the human body leaves an echo that can never truly vanish. But the architecture of this modern forensic science was cemented years before Pitchfork's arrest, born from a moment of unprecedented collaboration that fractured the trajectory of criminal investigation forever. On September 10, 1984, geneticist Dr. Alec Jeffreys pulled a piece of X-ray film from a developing tank at Leicester University and permanently stripped the shadow of anonymity from the criminal underworld. He had been researching restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP. By extracting DNA, cutting it with enzymes, and separating the fragments through gel electrophoresis, Jeffreys observed repetitive sequences he termed mini-satellites. Applying a radioactive probe generated an autoradiograph, the first visual barcode unique to every human being on Earth, save for identical twins. The justice system had reached its point of irreversibility. 3 miles away and 1 year prior, a different kind of shadow had fallen over the village of Narborough. The 1983 case file for Linda Mann detailed a meticulous crime scene, yet the physical evidence yielded only a blood type. It was an enzyme profile shared by 10% of the British male population. The investigation stalled. The perpetrator vanished into the statistical noise. 3 years later, the pattern repeated. The 1986 forensic report for Dawn Ashworth mirrored the first. The same methodology. The same blood type recovered from the scene. Under immense pressure, the Leicestershire Constabulary secured a confession from a 17-year-old local named Richard Buckland. The case appeared closed. The procedural machinery was ready to process a conviction, but the confession contained a blind spot. Buckland admitted to the second crime but adamantly denied the first. Seeking definitive proof to tie both cases together, investigators took an unprecedented step. They bypassed traditional serology and carried biological samples to the university laboratory, asking Dr. Alec Jeffreys to apply his newly discovered genetic barcode to a live criminal investigation. The autoradiograph results dismantled the entire prosecution. The genetic bands from both crime scenes matched each other perfectly, proving a single perpetrator was responsible. But they did not match Richard Buckland. The biological evidence directly contradicted the sworn confession. Buckland became the first person in history to be exonerated by DNA profiling. The investigation was back to zero, but armed with a new infallible weapon. The Leicestershire police initiated a forensic dragnet, demanding voluntary blood and saliva samples from 5,000 local men. It was an audacious logistical gamble. The chain of custody for thousands of vials had to be flawless. For months, the laboratory processed the samples. Every single one came back negative. The killer had successfully evaded the net. The failure of the mass screening was not a failure of the science, but a manipulation of the system. In August 1987, a bakery worker admitted in a pub that he had been paid £200 to submit a blood sample under a false name. The name he provided to the phlebotomist was Colin Pitchfork. When investigators arrested Pitchfork, they did not rely on interrogations or coerced statements. They drew his blood. The subsequent DNA profile was overlaid with the evidence recovered from the 1983 and 1986 crime scenes. The bands aligned with absolute mechanical precision. The probability of a false match was calculated at 1 in 30 billion. The conviction of Colin Pitchfork established a new global standard for investigative rigor. It proved that human memory is fallible, confessions can be fabricated, and witnesses can be deceived. But the biological ledger leaves an indelible mark. The echoes of a crime no longer vanish into the dark. They remain, locked in the genetic code, waiting for the light. The rise of DNA profiling did more than solve cold cases. It cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the older established forensic disciplines. If genetic sequencing offered mathematical certainty, microscopic hair comparisons suddenly looked dangerously close to subjective guesswork. The consequence of this new biological standard was a paradigm shift that would ultimately crack the foundation of the FBI laboratory. The Department of Justice could no longer ignore the widening chasm between genetic fact and visual estimation. As post-conviction DNA testing gained traction, it began to systematically dismantle verdicts that had relied entirely on a hair examiner's visual match. The legal community was forced to confront a terrifying reality, realizing that the evidentiary cornerstone of countless convictions was scientifically hollow. Behind every shattered verdict was a human life stolen by a confident expert on a witness stand. Innocent individuals had spent decades in maximum security facilities, their futures erased by a single strand of hair that never actually belonged to them. The tragedy was compounded by the absolute authority with which the state had delivered their sentences. The psychological toll on the exonerated was immeasurable, yet the collateral damage extended directly to the victims of the original crimes. They were forced to endure the agonizing revelation that the true perpetrators had remained free, shielded by a justice system that had paraded a false sense of closure built on flawed science. The betrayal cut through every layer of the judicial process. This reckoning triggered a systemic, nationwide audit of the FBI Microscopic Hair Analysis Unit. This review was not a mere procedural formality, but an unprecedented autopsy of institutional failure, spanning decades of criminal jurisprudence. Every case where a conviction hinged on a hair match was suddenly pulled back into the spotlight. Independent investigators combed through thousands of trial transcripts, meticulously comparing the actual laboratory bench notes against the exaggerated claims made under oath. The transition from blind trust to rigorous skepticism required the complete dismantling of a legacy that had long been considered the absolute gold standard of forensic science. Inside the federal archives where these case files were stored, the physical weight of the scandal became chillingly tangible. Endless rows of heavy steel filing cabinets housed the faded trial transcripts, the yellowed laboratory reports, and the fragile glass slides that had sealed the fates of so many defendants. The sheer volume of paper represented a bureaucratic machine that had operated without oversight. The sterile hum of the modern review rooms stood in stark contrast to the tense, dramatic courtrooms where these flawed testimonies were originally delivered. Under harsh fluorescent lights, a new generation of scientists peered through high-powered digital microscopes, examining the exact same slides from 30 years prior. They saw no definitive matches, only the undeniable, lingering shadows of human error. On August 8, 1986, A 17-year-old boy sat in an interrogation room in Leicestershire, England, and confessed to murder. By all traditional metrics of law enforcement, the case was closed. A confession secured a conviction. But the lead detective noticed a discrepancy in the timeline, a friction point between the boy's statement and the physical evidence. That hesitation triggered a sequence of events that dismantled centuries of investigative protocol and birthed the modern era of forensic science. The Leicestershire Constabulary was paralyzed by the shadow of two identical crimes. 3 years separated the murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, yet the pathology reports mirrored each other with mechanical precision. The perpetrator was a ghost, leaving behind only biological trace evidence. Semen samples that, in the mid-1980s, offered nothing more than a basic blood type. The blood group matched 10% of the local male population, a statistical blind spot. Just miles from the crime scenes, a geneticist named Alec Jeffreys was mapping the human genome at Leicester University. His research was not designed for criminal justice. He was studying hereditary diseases. But Jeffreys had recently discovered that certain regions of DNA contained repeating sequences unique to every individual, forming a genetic fingerprint. The constabulary approached Jeffreys with an unprecedented proposition. They needed to know if his academic technique could be applied to the degraded biological evidence from the crime scenes. The 1986 forensic report documented a grueling extraction process. The samples were heavily compromised, subjected to years of improper storage. Extracting intact DNA required isolating the cellular material, applying restriction enzymes to cut the DNA strands, and using a radioactive probe to expose the unique genetic sequence on an X-ray film. When the autoradiograph developed, the lines of genetic code presented a definitive cold truth. The biological evidence from the 1983 murder of Linda Mann and the 1986 murder of Dawn Ashworth originated from the exact same man. However, the genetic bands did not match the blood drawn from Richard Buckland, the 17-year-old kitchen porter who had confessed to the 1986 crime under intense interrogation. The confession was a psychological fabrication. In a historic precedent, the very first application of DNA profiling in a criminal investigation did not convict a killer, but exonerated an innocent suspect. Stripped of their primary target, the Leicestershire Constabulary initiated the Narborough Village Inquiry, the most ambitious forensic dragnet ever conceived. Authorities mandated voluntary blood and saliva samples from every male resident between the ages of 13 and 34 in Narborough, Enderby, and a third surrounding village. Over 5,000 men were processed. The chain of custody was meticulously maintained, each sample systematically cross-referenced against the killer's A-positive blood type before advancing to DNA extraction. The dragnet yielded 0 matches. The killer had vanished into the statistical noise, exposing a critical vulnerability in mass biometric collection. The system relies entirely on the perpetrator submitting authentic material. The fracture in the killer's defense did not come from a microscope, but from human error. In August 1987, a conversation overheard in a local pub exposed a proxy test. A local bakery worker named Colin Pitchfork had coerced a colleague into submitting a blood sample under his name, altering identification documents to bypass the clinic's security. Investigators immediately audited the chain of custody and moved on Pitchfork. On September 19, 1987, they apprehended him and secured a genuine blood sample under strict supervision. The subsequent genetic analysis provided an absolute match to the crime scene evidence, with the probability of an incidental match calculated at 1 in 30 billion. On January 22, 1988, Pitchfork was convicted and received a double life sentence. The biological record had spoken, entirely bypassing the need for a confession, eyewitness testimony, or circumstantial assumption. The undeniable precision of genetic fingerprinting created a new baseline for evidentiary standards, establishing the absolute supremacy of genetic profiling in criminal court. While nuclear DNA revolutionized the identification process, early testing required substantial biological material, typically blood or semen, which degrades rapidly. A crime scene is a hostile ecosystem. Ultraviolet radiation, moisture, and bacterial decomposition assault cellular structures by the hour. When investigators recover a single strand of hair left exposed to the elements for decades, the nuclear DNA within the root is often obliterated. The forensic focus had to shift to a more resilient genetic vault. That vault is found within the mitochondria, the cellular engines that power human biology. Unlike nuclear DNA, which exists as a single copy within the cell nucleus, mitochondrial DNA resides in the cytoplasm, with hundreds to thousands of copies per cell. This structural redundancy provides an extraordinary defensive mechanism against environmental degradation. Even when a hair shaft is weathered, brittle, and stripped of its root, the mitochondrial capsules remain fortified, preserving a maternal genetic code that can survive for centuries. Unlocking this cellular engine requires a meticulous extraction protocol. Forensic biologists deploy a chemical process to dissolve the keratin protein structure of the hair shaft without destroying the fragile genetic material trapped inside. The sample is bathed in a specialized buffer solution and subjected to enzymatic digestion. This controlled destruction strips away the biological armor, isolating the mitochondrial DNA for the next critical phase of analysis. Because the recovered genetic material from a rootless hair is microscopic, it must be replicated before it can be read. Technicians utilize the polymerase chain reaction technique, a thermal cycling process that acts as a molecular photocopier. By repeatedly heating and cooling the sample in the presence of specific enzymes, the laboratory synthesizes millions of copies of the target DNA sequences. This amplification transforms an invisible trace into a robust forensic profile ready for sequencing. Once amplified, the mitochondrial sequence is mapped and compared against a known reference sample. However, this system has a critical limitation inherent to its biology. Because mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from the mother, it is not unique to a single individual. A suspect, their siblings, their mother, and their maternal grandmother will all share the exact same mitochondrial profile. It cannot definitively identify a specific perpetrator with the absolute certainty of nuclear DNA. Yet, the true forensic power of mitochondrial testing lies in its capacity for absolute exclusion. If the mitochondrial sequence from a crime scene hair does not match the sequence of the suspect, that suspect is mathematically and biologically eliminated as the source. There is no margin for subjective interpretation, no reliance on the visual similarities of pigment granules or cuticle thickness. The genetic code either aligns or it does not. This binary certainty became the ultimate weapon against the subjective era of microscopic hair comparison. For nearly 40 years, juries had been swayed by confident experts claiming absolute visual matches between crime scene hairs and defendants. But as mitochondrial testing protocols became standardized in the late 1990s, defense attorneys and appellate organizations began petitioning courts to re-examine the physical evidence from closed cases. Hairs that had once secured convictions through the sworn testimony of FBI analysts were retrieved from evidence lockers. When subjected to genetic sequencing, the biological reality fractured the courtroom narratives. The absolute certainty of the genetic strand collided directly with the subjective claims of the FBI laboratory and its elite trace evidence unit. In case after case, mitochondrial DNA proved that the hairs presented to juries as conclusive links belonged to entirely different people. Men who had spent decades in maximum security prisons, some waiting on death row, were suddenly armed with incontrovertible proof of their innocence. The genetic data exposed a terrifying blind spot in the justice system, revealing that microscopic visual matches were frequently nothing more than optical illusions. These exonerations forced a reckoning that triggered the most massive evidence audit in federal history. The Department of Justice and the FBI formally acknowledged the crisis, launching an unprecedented systemic review of thousands of historical cases. The mandate was clear: re-examine every trial where microscopic hair analysis was a primary driver of the conviction. Investigators dug through archived evidence boxes, fragile court transcripts, and decades-old slide mounts. What the review uncovered was a statistical catastrophe. In over 90% of the initial cases reviewed, the forensic testimony regarding hair matches contained fundamental errors, often overstating the certainty of the match far beyond what the science could actually support. The transition to mitochondrial sequencing permanently dismantled a flawed forensic empire. Today, the microscopes still exist, but they are relegated to a preliminary screening role, explicitly barred from being presented as definitive proof of identity. The sterile hum of automated sequencers has replaced the quiet confidence of the lone analyst peering through a dual-lens comparator, ensuring that the burden of proof relies on the immutable laws of biology and chemistry. The dawn of genetic profiling cast a harsh, unforgiving light on older methodologies, but it also illuminated cold cases that had been frozen in forensic blind spots. On April 18, 2018, a digital file containing a sequence of raw genetic data was silently uploaded to an open-source ancestry website. For 40 years, the man attached to that DNA had been a phantom, leaving a trail of shattered lives across California while evading the most extensive manhunt in state history. The offender, known in case files as the East Area Rapist and later the Golden State Killer, operated with terrifying methodological precision between 1974 and 1986. He exploited the jurisdictional blind spots of the era, crossing county lines before centralized databases could effectively connect disparate crime scenes. The 1990s brought the advent of STR-DNA profiling, allowing investigators to finally link the physical evidence. The California Department of Justice confirmed a single perpetrator was responsible for the escalating series of crimes, yet the National DNA Database, CODIS, yielded nothing. If an offender had no prior qualifying felony conviction on record, their genetic signature was a key without a lock. The investigation stalled for decades. But the moment that upload completed in 2018, the phantom ceased to exist. He was no longer an unsolvable mystery. He had become a biological coordinate. For 3 decades, another phantom had haunted Wichita. The Wichita Police Department had exhausted traditional investigative avenues. The case files were a monument to dead ends, a sprawling archive of cold leads, negative fingerprint comparisons, and composite sketches that pointed nowhere. Decades of taunting letters from the killer had yielded nothing. But in 2004, the silence broke. A new series of communications began arriving at local media outlets. The killer, desperate for relevance, initiated a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with a newly formed BTK task force. Inside one of these communications rested a single purple 1.44 megabyte verbatim floppy disk. The sender believed this obsolete piece of magnetic storage was untraceable. Instead, it became the exact digital anchor that would dismantle a 30-year reign of terror and fundamentally alter the landscape of modern digital forensics. November 21, 1983. A secluded footpath in the English village of Narborough. The moment a local constable secures the perimeter around the body of 15-year-old Linda Mann marks a permanent fracture in the history of criminal investigation. The physical evidence left at the scene is microscopic, yet it holds the blueprint of the perpetrator. Traditional policing is about to hit a wall, forcing a desperate pivot toward a technology that does not yet exist in the forensic arsenal. The Leicestershire Constabulary operates on standard, time-tested protocols. The 1983 pathology report confirms the presence of biological evidence, which allows investigators to determine the suspect's blood type using the ABO system. The result is type A. It is a lead, but a mathematically hollow one. Type A blood is shared by roughly 10% of the British male population. The suspect pool remains vast, the evidence insufficient to narrow the focus. The investigation stalls into a cold, silent archive, February 16, 2005. Megabyte verbatim floppy disk slides into a drive at the Wichita Police Department. For 31 years, an unidentified predator has operated within the Kansas grid, leaving behind 10 victims and a meticulously curated archive of taunting letters. The drive clicks. In a matter of milliseconds, a hidden digital architecture renders on the screen, exposing a metadata footprint that will instantly dismantle 3 decades of investigative dead ends. The case file prior to this moment is a monument to forensic frustration. The offender, self-identified through his own acronym for bind, torture, kill, had vanished into the suburban landscape in 1991. The physical evidence preserved in the archives, ligatures, latent fingerprints, and biological fluids was substantial, yet entirely disconnected from a prime suspect. The forensic technology of the 1970s and 1980s could confirm the presence of an organized, control-oriented serial offender, but it could not provide a name. The case went cold. The trail became a blind spot in the annals of American law enforcement. On August 1, 1987, a casual conversation in a crowded Leicestershire pub shifted the trajectory of criminal forensics permanently. A bakery worker admitted to a colleague that he had submitted a blood sample to the police under a false name. That single admission did not just unravel a 3-year-old double homicide. It triggered the first genetic manhunt in history and redefined the architecture of the justice system. The 1983 pathology report for the first victim, Linda Mann, offered investigators a frustratingly narrow set of clues. Forensic technicians isolated a biological sample determining the perpetrator possessed a type A secretor blood profile. This biological signature belonged to roughly 10% of the British male population. It was an evidentiary blind spot. The parameters were too wide to secure a warrant, let alone a conviction. The investigation stalled, archived in the cold case files of the Leicestershire Constabulary. In the late autumn of 1986, Leicestershire Constabulary held a signed confession from a 17-year-old suspect, seemingly closing the book on one of the most intense manhunts in British history. But that document was about to collide with a microscopic sequence of nucleotides in a laboratory just a few miles away. The moment those two forces intersected, the global justice system was permanently rewritten. The investigations into the deaths of Linda Mann in 1983 and Dawn Ashworth in 1986 had pushed local authorities to their operational limits. Both victims were discovered in the same geographic cluster, leaving behind identical biological markers. When a local teenager with learning difficulties confessed to the Ashworth case, investigators assumed they had their perpetrator in custody. Yet a glaring blind spot remained in the case file. The suspect adamantly denied any involvement in the 1983 case, and his account of the 1986 crime contained severe structural inconsistencies, a secluded footpath known as the Black Pad in Narborough, Leicestershire. The discovery of a 15-year-old victim initiates an investigation that will permanently alter the trajectory of global criminal justice. The physical evidence is sparse. Leicestershire Constabulary recovers a biological fluid sample, but forensic science in the early 1980s is limited to conventional blood typing. The analysis confirms the perpetrator has type A secretor blood, a profile shared by 10% of the British male population. The trail goes cold. 3 years later, July 1986. A second victim is found in the neighboring village of Enderby. The modus operandi is identical. The biological evidence mirrors the 1983 crime scene. This time, investigators secure a confession from a 17-year-old local named Richard Buckland. He admits to the 1986 crime but adamantly denies any involvement in the 1983 case. The investigators face a critical blind spot. They have a confession, but the physical evidence linking the two events remains circumstantial. They need a definitive connection. A padded envelope arrives at the mail room of KSAS-TV in Wichita, Kansas. Inside is a single purple 1. The sender believes this obsolete piece of plastic is untraceable. That assumption will dismantle a 30-year reign of terror in exactly 8 days. For 3 decades, an entity known only by a self-assigned acronym evaded one of the most exhaustive manhunts in American history. The case file spanned thousands of pages, cataloging a phantom who communicated through taunting letters and cryptic ciphers, yet left zero actionable physical evidence at the scenes. The trail was dead. The investigative momentum stagnant. Until the suspect decided to adapt to the digital age, a secluded footpath in Leicestershire, England. This is the exact moment the biological debris left at a crime scene ceased to be a silent, untraceable byproduct and became an undeniable genetic barcode. The era of the anonymous predator ended the second a geneticist in a nearby laboratory realized that human DNA could be mapped, read, and weaponized for justice. For 3 years, the Leicestershire Constabulary pursued a phantom. The 1983 investigation into the death of Linda Mann yielded standard serology markers. Blood typing indicated the perpetrator had type A blood and an enzyme profile matching roughly 10% of the British male population. It was a statistical net far too wide to secure a conviction. The case went cold, relegated to the archives until July 1986, when a second victim, Dawn Ashworth, was discovered in a neighboring village on August 8, 1986. Detective Chief Superintendent David Baker stared at a laboratory autoradiograph that systematically dismantled his entire investigation. For months, Leicestershire Constabulary had a confessed suspect in custody for a high-profile homicide. The confession was documented. The prosecution was preparing for trial. But the dark horizontal bands on the X-ray film in front of Baker proved the teenager in their holding cell was entirely innocent. This was the precise moment the architecture of criminal justice fractured and rebuilt itself. The era of the confession was over. 3 years earlier, in November 1983, the investigation into the death of Linda Mann hit an absolute forensic wall. The scene yielded a biological sample, but forensic science in the early 80s was a blunt instrument. The 1983 serology report identified the suspect's blood type as type A, with a specific phosphoglucomutase enzyme profile, or PGM1+. This profile belonged to roughly 10% of the British male population. In a localized area, that left thousands of viable suspects. The physical evidence was meticulously preserved, but the trail went cold. The investigative blind spot was absolute. On February 16, 2005, a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk arrived at a local Kansas television station in a padded envelope. For 31 years, the entity known only as BTK had existed primarily as a phantom, a series of taunting letters and cold case files locked in the archives of the Wichita Police Department. But the moment that disk slid into a forensic drive, the phantom materialized into a man. This was the point of irreversibility. By early 2005, the task force was drowning in analog history. The initial crime scenes from the 1970s had yielded latent fingerprints and biological evidence, but the technology of the era offered no definitive matches. The trail had been dead for decades until the killer resurfaced in 2004, initiating a dangerous game of cat and mouse through local media. He communicated via photocopies, cryptic word puzzles, and packages left in public parks. 44-megabyte floppy disk arrives at the KSAS TV station in Wichita, Kansas. It is housed in a padded envelope, accompanied by a piece of jewelry and a photocopied book cover. For 30 years, the phantom known as BTK had terrorized the Midwest, leaving behind a trail of cold case files and taunting letters. But this disk is an entirely new breed of evidence. It is a digital artifact, and the exact moment it slides into the disk drive of a Wichita Police Department forensic computer, a 3-decade manhunt enters its terminal phase.